Hello and welcome to another episode of Handloader TV with me, your host, Jeremiah. And in this episode, we're going to run a full load development and review on this Marlin 1895 SBL that we have before us, chambered in 4570 government. Now, before we dive into all this stuff, I always like to start out with a brief little short history or a little bit of information on the cartridge itself. It was developed back in 1873 by the United States Army, and it was a pretty big leap forward for the Army at that time. It went on to become the standard issue cartridge for the United States Army, and it saw lots of use, and it was well praised. The original loading for the 4570 government cartridge was a 45 caliber bullet behind 70 grains of powder, which is where you get the 4570 designation, with a 405 grain bullet. And velocity was around 1,350 feet per second, so that was nothing to sneeze at. And while they did have other metallic cartridges around at that time, this was a huge leap forward for the U.S. Army because at the time most standard issued small arms were in fact muzzleloading rifles. And at the peak of the Civil War, when this cartridge was introduced, it really was a game changer. So there were a few, Spencer carbines and stuff like that out there that were using metallic cartridges, but this is what became the U.S. Army's standard issue. So it's a very cool cartridge with a very cool history. You could write an entire book about its feats and its capabilities and what it's done throughout history. So it's one of my personal favorite cartridges. And of course, the 4570 has aged quite well. It's still being commercially loaded today by major manufacturers such as Federal, Remington, so on and so forth. And it's very popular to this day, still winning matches and competitions and all kinds of things. So a great cartridge all around. It's aged like a fine wine. And with that, we also have more modern and interesting firearms to go with this cartridge that can handle more pressure than the original trapdoor rifles. But we'll talk about that more in a little bit. Now, before I dive into the details on the rifle itself, it would be amiss for me not to talk a little bit about the history of the company, Marlin. It dates back to at least 1870. Marlin made and sold many different guns, notably the model 1881 lever action to compete with the Winchester lever action. It was an interesting and unique design at the time, and most importantly, it was chambered in big bore cartridges such as the 4570. And at the time, Winchester did not have anything to compete with that. Now, if you fast forward to 1895, that's when our model comes into play. And it was in production for around 20 or so years before it was finally discontinued. And it saw reasonable sales and reasonable success. I believe there's about, don't quote me on it, but about 20,000 of those were made in that 20-year period. So it wasn't a huge seller for Marlin, but it did okay. Now you fast forward all the way up to 1972, and you have the reintroduction of the model 1895. And it gained a lot of popularity. There was still a lot of people very interested in the 4570 cartridge and all of its characteristics that go along with it. And I believe it was around 2008, Remington Arms Company, Freedom Group, Cerebus Group went ahead and purchased Marlin and all of its assets. And with that came some issues. They were experiencing quality control issues with the stocks cracking, rough patches, you name it. They had all kinds of issues, and they switched from the standard cut rifled barrels to a micro groove barrel, which unfortunately really was detrimental to the accuracy of cast bullets in those firearms. Because of that, a lot of people shied away from the Marlin name. It kind of stained their reputation, which up until this point had been very, very good. Now later on, Remington finally figured out how to make these Marlins, and they fixed the quality control issues, and there are quite a few really nice, really good Remington-owned, Marlin-made firearms on the market today. Then fast forward on, and Remington fairly recently declared bankruptcy, and the Remington brands, including Marlin, were sold off. And that was a really sad day when Remington went under like that. And the brands were sold off, and they still continue to this day. But a big name in the industry passed the torch on to other companies. And Marlin was actually snatched up by Ruger. And then the anticipation really started to build as Ruger went around looking at the Marlin design, looking at how they could make it their own, looking for things that they could improve on, and just restarting the production of these fine Marlin lever actions. So as the anticipation was building, they were working on it, and that brings us to the rifle we have before us today. This is a Ruger-made Marlin, chambered in 4570 Government. It's an 1895 model SBL. And that was a very popular model. It was seen in a few movies. Wind River is one that comes to mind right off the bat, and I do love that movie, and I love the Marlin lever action in that movie. So it's a bit of an iconic firearm looking at these lever actions. So on that note, let's go ahead and take a little bit of a closer look at the one we have before us today. So before diving too deep into the details of this particular rifle, I want to encourage you guys to check out our sister publication, Rifle Magazine. The current issue is number 322, and in this issue you'll see the Marlin on the cover along with me and my horse. I'm not sure how I wound up on there, but I did. And in that issue is a great feature article from Brian Pearce on the Marlin 1895 lever action. And he used a different lever action. It's not this exact lever action. So since these videos are only sample sizes of one, I think it would be greatly beneficial to read his article and watch this video, and then you can compare and contrast our different experiences with the same model but different exact rifles. So I highly encourage you guys, check that out. You won't be disappointed. And Brian also does a much better job than I do of diving into the company history and explaining just exactly what went on. So on that note, these Ruger-made Marlins are starting to ship out. They're trickling out there slowly to various distributors and gun shops. I've seen a few of them in stock online, albeit for a little bit of a high premium price. But it's great to see that these lever actions are starting to be produced and they're trickling down to the public. So that is fantastic. And I think that price point will come down in time. The Ruger or Marlin MSRP for this rifle is, I believe, about $1,400. So, and as I'm sure you guys were aware, the original Marlins were going for a very pretty penny when production stopped and Remington went bankrupt. But I digress. Let's go ahead and dive into the details of this rifle, starting out with this recoil pad at the back here. It feels very similar to me to a Pachmayr decelerator. If it isn't, it's very similar. And it does a great job of controlling and help mitigate the recoil generated from the 4570 Government cartridge. And it has the Marlin logo on the back there, which is a nice touch. We have the traditional gray laminated stock and forend here, which is a signature of the SBL model. Now, one thing I noticed in shooting this, I've put about 200 rounds already through this particular rifle, just kind of getting a feel for it and everything. And with the Ghost Ring sights, which are factory sights installed on this, we'll talk about that in a moment, but the comb height is just about right for those. It's almost a chin weld, if you will, on me, my particular build. However, with the inclusion of an optic like we have on here, it might be advantageous to add a little bit of height to that comb. Maybe use something like a stock sleeve or something of that nature to establish a cheek weld. But a chin weld has its own advantages, especially when you want a wide field of view. You want to be able to see what's happening downrange and have a little bit better situational awareness. I think a chin weld is actually advantageous in that situation, especially with faster follow-up shots or perhaps leading a running deer or something of that nature. If we go ahead and flip this rifle over here, we can see that there are sling swivels at the rear and the front of the rifle. Those are very solid. They don't turn, which I can appreciate. I hate it when they loosen up and they turn. So that's a nice feature there. And one of the distinguishing features between an original Marlin and a Ruger-made Marlin is this bullseye right here. As I'm sure you know, the original bullseye was black and white, and the Ruger-made Marlins are red and white. And fundamentally, looking at this rifle overall, That's one thing I have to say, Ruger did a really good job of not changing it. Fundamentally, it is a Marlin 1895 SBL lever action rifle. I greatly appreciate the fact that they didn't go in there and change up everything. They just kind of tweaked a few little things to make it a little bit better and to make it their own, like the bullseye there. And I can greatly appreciate that. So we have checkering up here at the grip, and we have the signature big loop lever there. We also have a cross bolt safety here. Right now it's in the fire position. I can flip it over to the safe position here, and I can easily actuate that safety with my trigger finger without breaking my grip too badly. And on this side of the action, it is red, red for dead. Red means you're ready to fire. So that's a nice visual indicator there of whether the rifle is on safe for fire. And we have a 3-position hammer as well. So there's the fired position, there is the half cock, and there is full cock there. I also added the hammer spur onto this particular rifle because we have an optic on there, and that hammer spur was included with our rifle. And let's see here. Another distinguishing feature of the Ruger-made Marlins is in the serial number, which is on this side of the receiver. It's going to be hard to see there, but it's stamped RM, and RM stands for Ruger-made Marlin, which is kind of neat. Now, as I said, I have put quite a few rounds through this rifle. The action, although when I first got it, was a little bit clunky, now it feels very, very nice. Very smooth, very clean, no drag, and it operates very, very nicely. I'm impressed with how much it's slicked up from the time it came out of the box to where it is at now, about 200 rounds later. Feels very nice. Also, I'll be happy to report that the loading of the Marlin is not one of those thumb-pinching, excruciating procedures. It's actually very simple, it's very nice, and it goes relatively smoothly. The trigger on this guy, I want to point that out before I forget. On an average of 5 pulls on this Wheeler Engineering trigger pull gauge we have here, it broke cleanly and relatively crisply, but it was heavy at 7 pounds 4 ounces. Now that's not terrible, but it is something to note. 7 pounds 4 ounces on this particular trigger for this rifle. I think a gunsmith could slick that up relatively easily, but that might be something to look into for the future. We have the XS Sights lever gun rail that came factory mounted on here with a ghost ring rear sight, which I have removed for the optic's sake. And we have a front sight that is a fiber optic, and it's also tritium lit. And that works really, really well, actually. I'm hiking around in the woods at night with it, looking through it. It's very easy to pick up. It's very clear. And I think that's a huge advantage and a nice feature that they added to the lever action here. As for the barrel is stainless steel, as with the action and everything on here. Very rugged, very robust, and very easy to remove scratches from with a little bit of a light abrasive and some polishing compound. So very rugged, reliable finish on there, easy to clean. I like that. The barrel's 19 inches in length, 1 in 20 right-hand twist, and it is threaded from the factory 11/16 by 24. So you can easily add a muzzle brake to it. You can add a suppressor if you're into that. Or if you're a traditionalist and a purist, you can simply keep the thread adapter on there, and it still has a really nice clean look to it. The magazine tube holds 6 rounds, and you can fit 1 in the chamber for a total capacity of 7 rounds, which in my opinion is pretty good. And a little technical note on that, something that people often don't take into consideration with lever actions and the magazine tube being mounted to the barrel like this, especially with 4570, these cartridges are heavy, and every cartridge you have in there is adding weight that is hanging off the barrel. And that can affect your harmonics from shot to shot. Now that is just something to consider and take into consideration as you shoot these rifles and work with them. Let's see here, last but not least, we have the optic up here. The optic we chose was a Leupold VX3 HD 2.5 to 6 by 36 optic. It's nice, lightweight, and compact. And I think it looks pretty good on the lever action. I know some purists out there say you should never have optics on lever actions, but I'll be honest with you, I did not want to try and shoot small groups at 100 yards with the factory ghost ring sights. And this addition of this optic is going to greatly help me shoot smaller groups. And it's still got a low enough magnification range at 2.5 to allow for rapid sight acquisition and rapid follow-up shots. And we'll show some of that off once we finish our load development. Overall, I really like these scopes as well. They feature the CDS ZL turrets on there, which is a locking turret. I've had this rifle hiking around. I've had it in the scabbard on horseback, and that is a real torture test for optics. And this locking turret has never once moved on me. So a testament to how well built and how rugged the loopholed turrets are. Also, we have it mounted in loopholed Qrw2 rings. These are their quick release rings. These are fantastic rings, some of my absolute favorite on the market, and it just makes perfect sense to use those on a lever action rifle because it allows me to rapidly remove the optic and use my iron sights, or return the optic and maintain 0 and use the optic for my shooting. And a little pro tip, because we do a lot of optic testing on here, and like I said, this was on the scabbard of a horse, so I wanted to see just how rugged this system is and if the scope moved at all. If you take a lead pencil and you simply mark on the scope body, it shows up really, really nicely, and you'll be able to tell if that scope moved at all in its mounting system, which this one has not so far. We'll check it again at the end of this video. But they're very rugged systems, and I don't expect any issues in that regard. So the primers have fallen on the floor now. I think that's my cue to move on to the hand loading segment. So the very first thing we need to talk about when we talk about reloading ammunition is pressures, especially in the 4570 government cartridge. And there is a ton of confusion over what pressure levels you can load for what firearms. And if you consult various reloading manuals, chances are your Lyman manual isn't going to be in line with your Western Powders manual, and your Alliant manual is going to be different than your Hornady manual. And the pressures can just be kind of all over the place for this cartridge. So on that note, SAAMI maximum pressure is set at 28,000 cup. That is the maximum pressure for 4570. However, the 4570 was developed in 1873, as we pointed out earlier. And there has been a lot of innovation in firearms and technology and even powders since then. It started out as a black powder cartridge. So this 28,000 PSI figure is not safe for all guns. In the older Springfield Model 1873 trapdoor actions, I would highly recommend that you stay below the 21,000, probably even 18,000 PSI for those weaker actions, and actions of similar strength to those trapdoor Springfields. Now, of course, SAAMI maximum pressure, 28,000 PSI, is suitable in a wide range of firearms, and for time's sake, I don't want to get into and list all those various firearms. But a lot of times, that is the pressure that the Marlin 1895 is held to. However, I can tell you, looking at this Ruger-made Marlin and having experience with previous Marlin rifles, the 1895 is capable of handling much more pressure than that. In fact, Garrett cartridges loads to 33,000 to 35,000 PSI. And I have no doubts that this particular Ruger-made Marlin can easily handle those kinds of pressures. And a lot of people will argue that the Marlin 1895 rifles can handle up to 43,500 PSI. And that is a pressure level that is set for modern guns. A lot of the Ruger number 1s are held to that pressure level, Ruger number 3s, and certain 4570s built on Mauser actions. And I would agree with that. I see no reason why this current Ruger-made Marlin couldn't handle that 43,000 PSI mark. However, I do think it would cause, or at least accentuate, the wear and tear on the action and the rifle itself. And that is something to take into consideration. Also, the recoil would be quite severe at that pressure level. But I do think the rifle is capable of handling that much pressure. Do I recommend loading it up to that much pressure? Not really, no. Can it handle it? Yes. Is it safe? Yes, but you should use extreme caution if you're going to be working up to that pressure level. And for this video, most of the loads are going to be less than 35,000 PSI. So on that note, let's go ahead and walk you through what we did to develop our loads. So now that we've established safe pressures for our rifle and what we'll be loading up to, although most of my loads are going to be well below that 43,000 PSI mark, but we know what we can load up to, let's go ahead and take a moment to walk through some of the components that we've selected, because there are a few special considerations to make. So first up, for all of our brass, we've decided to use Starline cases. I've found them to be of exceptional quality, reasonably priced, and to be honest with you, when you start to push pressures up into the relatively high area of the 4570, I found that Starline cases hold up better, and I get more reloads out of them, better case life from Starline cases. The primer pockets stay nice and tight. I don't have split necks or case head separations or anything like that with Starline cases. So for this entire load development series, we'll be using Starline cases throughout. The next thing that we've selected is RCBS dies, simply because back in the day, our local Sportsman's Warehouse had them in stock. I picked them up, and they've been working really well for me ever since. And also, I have a Lee Factory Crimp Die for a few bullets that we'll be trying out that don't have a crimp groove on them. So for those kinds of bullets, I'll be using the Lee Factory Crimp Die. It is important to apply a crimp to your case, not only for consistent and uniform powder burn and ignition, but it's also important for feeding from the magazine tube. And on that note, there are also special considerations to take into when it comes to selecting your bullets. So we have some HSM round nose flat point bullets. We have some Meister hard cast bullets here that are also flat nose. And the reason being is when you have a cartridge in this magazine tube, they're stacked one on top of another. And so what can happen is when you have bullets up against primers, you can actually have under recoil or vigorous use or stuff like that, you can have a pointy bullet strike that primer and actually potentially set off that primer and cause a magazine tube detonation. You'd ignite that one cartridge and it would cause severe damage to your magazine tube and potentially your rifle. So we want to avoid that at all costs, and therefore we have decided to use bullets that are of appropriate construction to prevent that from happening. So flat point bullets are a go-to for that. And also Hornady has some really unique and interesting options available in their Monoflex and FTX line of bullets. What they have in there is a tip. It's a ballistic tip, if you will, a plastic tip, but it's flexible. So because of that, there's no chance that you will cause a primer detonation with that bullet, even when they're stacked right on top of each other. So a really neat option, and I'm excited to see how those bullets perform. There's also some special considerations to take into account when loading these bullets, but we'll talk about that at the end of this. The next company that we'll be using as far as bullets brands is Montana Bullet Works. Now, I've known the guys at Montana Bullet Works a while. I've been using their bullets for a very long time. They've always been exceptionally high quality cast bullets. And some of my favorites are these LBTs in the 4570. I found them to work very, very well. They make one of my favorite bullets for the 45 Colt. I've used the heck out of that. And the neat thing about Montana Bullet Works is not only do they make their own, design bullets, LBTs and stuff like that, they also cast bullets from commercially available molds and consumer available molds, such as this bullet here, which is from a Lyman mold. I actually have this mold, and I can use the same load data for my mold, the loads that I've already worked up and know work well with this bullet. I can use that with a commercially available bullet that I don't have to cast because Montana does all the work for me. Sometimes I don't have time to cast a couple hundred bullets up for these videos, so it's really nice that they have that option available for the consumer. And they also offer things in various hardness levels so you can match the hardness of your cast bullet to the pressure you're going to be pushing, which is very important for accuracy. We've also selected some high quality powders, a few of my favorite. This Trail Boss is simply here because I have a feeling at the end of our load development for shooting at plinking at targets and steel and stuff, I have a feeling I'm going to be using a load of Trail Boss to kind of save my shoulder. So that's why that's there. On that note, let's go ahead and walk you through step by step loading this cartridge up, and we'll just kind of give you a brief overview of what I did to develop all of these loads in the 4570. So first up, we need to size our Starline cases. And to do that, I'm using RCBS full-length sizing die screwed down until it contacts the shell holder. The lubricant I'm using is Hornady Unique Case Lube. Now this is pretty good stuff. I also like Redding Imperial Sizing Die Wax. That's a personal favorite of mine. And what I like to do with this Unique is kind of run it around the rim edge of the cartridge there, so I get plenty of lubricant on the inside of the case mouth, and then I'll run it up through and around the whole body like that, and I'll begin sizing. And you have to be careful, especially with lubricants like Hornady Unique and stuff like that, because as you're sizing your cases, if you apply too much case lubricant, it's very easy to get dents and dings and marks on your cases. Because it is a long straight wall case, there's a lot of a force that's going into the sizing die and applying pressure on this case. And if you're not careful, they'll usually, on my particular die, I've noticed them right around here, about 3/4 of the way up the case, there'll be dents and dings and stuff like that. So you want to ensure that you apply just enough lubricant, not too much, not too little, just enough to where it goes into the die nice and easy, doesn't require excessive force, and it's a smooth operation. So once you've finished sizing all of your cases, the next step in the reloading process, since it is a straight-walled case, slightly tapered albeit, but it's essentially a straight-walled case, we need to expand or flare our case mouth. Now this die is pre-set up for this, so I'll run it up here. But basically what you want to do is start out with a minimum amount of flare, slowly screw the die in until you reach the desired flare, and your bullet will seat and sit nice and square in there. And some bullets, depending on how they are, will sit deeper than others. So I recommend applying the minimum amount of flare to get your bullet to sit squarely on that case mouth, whatever kind of bullet you may be using. And if it sits squarely, nice and, uniform there, vertical, straight up and down, then you're good to go. This might need actually just a smidge more, because especially with cast bullets, you really don't want to be shaving any of that lead off. It's not conductive to accuracy. So we'll check that. That seems a little bit better. It just drops in ever so slightly. And also, in order to aid with consistent powder burn, you're going to want this case to grip that bullet. So you don't want to overexpand it and over flare it, because your crimp is not strong enough to make up for an over-flared, over-expanded cartridge case. Now from here, the lubricant that is still inside the case mouths kind of aids in the case expansion. There we go, just like that. So then the next step would be to prime our cases. And for all of our primers that we're going to be using, we'll be using Winchester large rifle primers, just standard primers. And for priming, I personally really like using this Frankfurt Arsenal hand priming tool. I find it very easy and efficient and quick. So it's already preset. I've got my primers loaded up in here. We'll throw a few in there. And from this point, what I like to do is to generally, I'll wipe off all of the lubricant from the case. And of course, I don't have a rag present here, but it is important to remove that lubricant on the inside of the case mouth, inside the case, and on the case body, because it can slightly affect pressures, but also as you're dumping your powder in, especially if you're using a ball powder, then what can actually happen is your powder will stick on there, and it's just, it can be a mess. So I highly recommend wiping off all the case lubricant. From there, I like to take my chamfer and deburr tool. This one's from RCBS. And what I do is I just run a quick deburr on it and a nice little chamfer and deburr, clean up the case mouth. And what that's going to do is it's going to allow my cast bullet to easily seat, and it's going to prevent me from shaving any of this lead off this uniformly cast bullet, because you really don't want to deform your bullets before you squeeze the trigger. It's not conducive to accuracy. So typically the next step that we do would be to charge our cases, and for time's sake, as this video is probably going to be running a little bit long, I'm going to skip showing you that, but suffice it for me to tell you the process that I used for charging my cases was I loaded up the RCBS Matchmaster with whichever powder I was using, and weighed and dispensed all my charges on the RCBS Matchmaster, and all charges are accurate to 0.04 of a grain. So we'll load up a couple of dummy cases, cartridges here, if you will, and we'll show you what the seating process and the crimping process looks like. And it will save us a good deal of time. So now our cases are here, they would be charged, and let's go ahead and seat some bullets. So what I like to do is set that down into the case, get it as square as I can, and then I'll run it up into the sizing die, or I'm sorry, into the seating die. And I will generally always seat to the upper portion of the crimp groove for these bullets. And that is one thing that you guys need to consider, because in order for these cartridges to feed from the magazine, they must be short enough. If they are too long, that's the wrong one, they will not feed from the magazine into the chamber, and they can actually bind up your gun, and it's a heck of a mess. You'll have to take it apart, disassemble it in order to get that case out of there, and it's a big old mess. So you want to ensure that your overall loaded length is short enough to accommodate your magazine. Do not load past magazine length. So for these, with the 420 grain Montana Bullet Works LBTs, these are at 2.486 inches roughly for that. So from there, once I've loaded everything up, and depending upon the bullet that I've selected, let's go ahead and seat one of these guys as well. You'll notice that this bullet does not have a crimp groove anywhere on it. For this bullet, I will use the Lee Factory Crimp Die. Just gonna kind of run this in, eyeballing it till it's about where I want it. I need it to go a little bit deeper because I want it to feed from the magazine. That is important. I do believe I like these around 2.450 inches, somewhere around there, roughly speaking. So the next step and the final step in the loading process will be to crimp our cartridge cases. So since these guys here all have crimp grooves, I'm going to use a standard roll crimp that is built into this RCBS die. So as you can see, I'll back out the seating stem slightly so that it does not seat my bullet any deeper. Then from here, if I can get my die to loosen up, there we go. I'm going to run the case up into the die, screw the die down until I feel it contacting. Okay, I'm going to give it about 1/8 of a turn more, raise the ram, set my lock ring, and inspect my case. Okay, I want a little bit more crimp on that, especially when we're loading the high pressures, heavy recoil. You do not want that bullet to jump out of that case, especially in the magazine tube. So that is what I would call a medium crimp, maybe slightly heavy crimp, but I would call that probably a medium roll crimp. And you can see how the crimp ring has literally rolled that brass into the groove that is in that bullet. So that looks pretty good to me. And I would also encourage you, the crimp measurement is going to be different, but you can take a before and after measurement of your crimp and kind of give you a rough idea of how much crimp you've applied to said cartridge. This one's at about 0.479, 479 thousandths of an inch. But that will vary between case manufacturers and various other variables in the equation. Now, when it comes to bullets that do not have a crimp groove in them, such as this guy right here, when you don't have a crimp groove, I highly recommend using the Lee Factory Crimp Die. So I'll spin my turret head over to that, and what we're going to do is apply this crimp here. This is a collet style crimping die, and that was a pretty stout push there. That looks pretty good. And you can kind of see how the brass has rolled slightly, but it's more of a collet style crimp, so that entire brass is being squeezed on all the surface area around it to create a nice uniform crimp. And this is an excellent option for bullets that do not have a crimp groove or a canalure. So there you have it. There's the basic nuts and bolts on how to reload 4570 cartridges for your Marlin lever action. Fairly simple, fairly straightforward. On a side note here, there are some special considerations to take into account when you're loading the Hornady Monoflex and FTX bullets. And that consideration is case length. Because of the ogive shape of the Hornady FTX and the Monoflex bullets, a lot of times you'll have to trim the cases in order to get them to feed and function from the magazine if you're crimping in the crimp groove or the canalure. Now, with the Hornady Monoflex bullets, I was able to get them to feed and function by seating the bullet deeper into the case and then using a Lee Factory Crimp Die to simply crimp it in place at that deeper seating depth. And I did get it to function and feed from the firearm. However, after shooting a few groups with that, I went ahead and decided that it would be more productive and conductive to accuracy to simply trim the cases down. So a standard 4570 case is 2.100 inches in length, and the case length that you want to trim down to that Hornady specifies is 2.040 inches. And what that'll do with that shorter case, you're able to seat that bullet to the canalure or to the crimp ring, and it will still feed and function from your magazine tube. And also, in my experience, limited, albeit just a single test for this video, was that accuracy was slightly better with the shorter cases. Now, perhaps that is because I'm getting better case fill, with the shorter case. I'm not really sure, but there could be something to that, and it's food for thought at any rate. Perhaps one day that can be something we can look into for future testing. However, if you want to seat these bullets correctly into the crimp ring or the canalure, highly recommend trimming your cases to 2.040 inches. And that's what we're going to do in all of our tests moving forward with the Monoflex and FTX bullets. So I actually have all my ammunition already loaded up and ready to go hit the range. I've loaded up over 250 rounds for this particular rifle to try out and just work up some good loads. And what we're going to be doing is showing you the best results that we get. So we'll take the top 5-ish loads that we get with this rifle, and we'll show them to you. If you guys want to see all of the loads that we tested, the good, the bad, and the ugly, and all that stuff, then I highly encourage you guys to head on over to our website, loaddata.com, and type in 4570 government and look for the Handloader TV loads. And it's from there you'll be able to see everything, the good, the bad, and the ugly, the group sizes, the velocities that we got, the powders we used. The only thing you won't be able to see is the powder charge, because that is reserved for subscribers, and it's a great way for you to subscribe to that website, and it directly supports what we do over here on Handloader TV. So on that note, let's go ahead and take this rifle. We'll go hit the range and see what it can do. So we're out on the range, and we've been out here about an hour shoring up the target because of the wind we're experiencing and just getting set up. And I've been periodically checking the wind. And today it is a windy day, unfortunately. We're dealing with winds anywhere from, I'd say, 10 to 14 miles per hour with gusts up to 25 miles per hour today, according to my Kestrel 5700. So just keep that in mind as we're shooting these groups. Now, and according to the Kestrel, the temperature is about 75 degrees Fahrenheit. It is beautiful in that regard. Humidity is 14%, and pressure is 25.10 in Hg. This next load is using accurate 2230 powder, a 36.5 grain charge with a 465 grain Montana Bullet Works LBT LFN with gas check. Starline cases, which are standard length of 2.100 inches, Winchester large rifle primers to ignite our powder charge, and our overall loaded length is 2.400 inches. A little bit short, but I found it to work well and feed well. All right, let's watch the wind. For this load, we'll be using IMR 4198 powder, a 47.5 grain charge with 325 grain Hornady FTX bullet. Starline cases trimmed down to 2.040 inches. These are the short cases. Winchester large rifle primers. Overall loaded length of 2.560 inches. Wind still looks pretty good. Downrange. It's pretty calm, settled down some. Put a good group on paper. And in this load, we're using accurate 2200 powder, a 49 grain charge with a 250 grain Hornady Monoflex bullet. Starline cases, which have been trimmed to 2.040 inches. They are the short cases. Winchester large rifle primers, and our overall loaded length is 2.570 inches. The wind looks pretty good down there. Shooting between gusts here, so let's see if we can't put a nice little group on the paper. The next load that we're trying is using Ramshot Exterminator powder, a 42 grain charge with a 420 grain Montana Bullet Works LBT with gas check. Starline cases, which are regular 4570 standard length cases at 2.100 inches. Winchester large rifle primers, and our overall loaded length is 2.4100 inches. All right, got one in the chamber. Wind flags look good. So some of you watching might recognize this rifle and this guy right here from Rifle Magazine. He was on the cover, and so was his rifle. And we thought we'd kind of tie it all together because there's a great article in there. I'd highly encourage you guys to check it out if you haven't already. We thought we'd have a little fun and shoot the steel, hopefully working together. So let's see what we can do. There it is. I'd adjust a little bit for wind. job. All right, we're back from the range now after putting a ton of lead and ammunition through this rifle, testing it out, working up different loads. And before we dive into the results, one thing I want to put a little bit of a disclaimer or a caveat on this. We were really fighting the wind, and unfortunately it is just that time of year. I wound up putting a wind flag at 50 yards and a wind flag at 100 yards and having a wind flag at the bench just so I could see what the wind was doing at each of those distances, and to try and only shoot when the wind was calm, because I was experiencing bullet drift up to 2.5, maybe even 3 inches, and that's really not conducive to accuracy when you're trying to shoot less than an inch groups at 100 yards. So just keep in mind the wind factor on all of this. So on that note, let's go ahead and take a look at our first target that we shot, which was using accurate 2230 powder, a personal favorite powder of mine, a 36.5 grain charge, and we got a group size of 1.49 inches. And I do know that could have been a little bit smaller if it wasn't for the wind, because the target that we shot previous to this one with a slightly stouter powder charge had a group size of 0.72 inches. So that was really good, but the 5th round on that target flew 3 inches to the left, or almost 3 inches, and I truly think that was wind there. But I'm also dealing with a little bit of shooter fatigue, sitting there behind the rifle waiting for the wind to die down so I can shoot my group. It does get tiresome. Another thing to consider in when we look at the accuracy and group sizes here. But all in all, I'm not too upset with those results. 1.5 inches at 100 yards with the 45-70. 465 grain bullet, it's going to get the job done, and it's more than adequate for hunting purposes. The next load that we went ahead and tried was using the same IMR 4198 powder, a 47.5 grain charge with a 325 grain Hornady FTX bullet. Now I gotta say, these bullets, these Hornady FTX and the Hornady Monoflex, they perform really well in my humble opinion. Especially in the wind. I noticed that these drifted less than the majority of the bullets that we tried in the wind. And I wouldn't have noticed that if it wasn't for how windy it was, but they do work very well. And we got a group size of 1.73 inches, a mediocre standard deviation and extreme spread, but pretty impressive velocity at 2,020 feet per second on average. So not too bad there, and again, wind factor. The next load is using accurate 2200 powder, a 49 grain charge with a 250 grain Hornady Monoflex bullet. This is grouped into a 1.33 inch group, and that is pretty good in my book. I'm very happy with the results we got with that particular bullet. And overall, I would not hesitate to use that load in the future in the 45-70 for hunting and that sort of thing. The final load that we tried is using Ramshot Exterminator powder. This is a 42 grain charge with a 420 grain Montana Bullet Works LBT with gas check. We got a pretty good standard deviation and extreme spread there, not stellar, but decent, and respectable velocity at 1,609 feet per second on average, and the group size was right at 1.99 inches, so just under 2 inches. Overall, I'm not going to complain too much about that. I'm pretty happy with those results, especially given how windy it was on that day. And one thing, I think we oftentimes get caught up in group size and how accurate is the rifle, does it shoot this big? But we also have to keep in mind, this is a 45-70 lever action rifle. It's a brush gun. It's a guide gun, if you will. It's not designed to go out and hit somebody in the next county. That said, if these group sizes of, right around an inch to say even 2 inches, if it can maintain that at distance without any wind, I could see this rifle easily being able to reach out to 300, 400, even 500 yards on steel or paper targets. I could see hits being highly possible with this. It's more than accurate. And at that point, at that distance, you're really running out of gas in the 45-70 with the weight of bullet that you're shooting. So all in all, I find this to be more than sufficient for my own needs. But of course, as always, you've seen the results as we've shown them, and you be the judge. So now you've seen the results for yourself, and you can make an educated and informed decision on how the rifle performed and if this is something that you would like to add to your own collection. Now, I do have a few personal thoughts and things that I'd like to share with you, but of course these are just my own opinions and own reflections from shooting and working with this rifle. So take them with a grain of salt for what they're worth. On that note, there is a few things that I think are worth pointing out. And I'll go ahead and start out with my complaints. There's not really very many of them, but there's two things that I have noticed. One is pretty much an observation. As I said with the ghost ring sights, the comb height on the stock is perfect for that. It's no problem. I actually prefer it. However, with optics mounted on top of this rifle, I do like the addition of this butt cuff. And this is just something I made really quick so I could, shoot groups a little bit better, hopefully, for the video and have a nice cheek weld. And it does work quite well. I like it quite a bit. And with the optic, that might be something you should consider for yourself adding to your rifle. And it will help with a consistent cheek weld. The other thing that I noticed with this particular rifle is that when I was shooting groups, I would find myself squeezing the trigger and squeezing and squeezing. And I would start to, after a while, anticipate the shot a little bit because the recoil is pretty stout on this cartridge and the trigger pull weight is a little bit heavy. Again, the trigger pull weight on this particular rifle, when tested it on an average of 5 pulls on this Wheeler Engineering trigger pull gauge, it was 7 pounds 4 ounces. So just a little bit heavy. Certainly tolerable and certainly serviceable and usable, but that is what it is, kind of thing. There was no creep, there was no gritty feeling, it was just simply heavy. The next thing I noticed was while I was walking around and hiking with this rifle, carrying it in the field, I noticed that the trigger just kind of wiggles just a little bit. And I'm not sure if you can hear that or see that. The trigger's just a little bit loose on this guy. It wiggles around. And to be honest with you, I have quite a few lever actions that have that exact same issue to one degree or another. This one seems slightly excessive, if I can even say that. But it's just something I noticed in using and walking with and carrying and riding on horseback with this particular rifle. Overall, I think the rifle has proven to be extremely rugged, extremely reliable. The finish is very scratch resistant. If you really want to test the finish of your firearm or the durability of your optic, throw it on a horse and go for a full run for a few, maybe like 4 or 5 miles, and just let that horse run as long as his heart's content, which is exactly what I did, and it will beat the snot out of your rifle. And this thing took it like a champ. I'm really, really happy with it. I think the Ruger-made Marlins are fantastic. I think Ruger got it right. They kept the original heart of the rifle. It is still a model 1895 SBL. They just made a few minor changes to make it their own. And I think they did an absolutely fantastic job at it. I was very pleased with the accuracy performance given the environmental conditions. It shot cast bullets just as well as it shot jacketed bullets, which is very nice and a testament to the cold hammer forged barrel that they're using over the micro groove rifling that Remington was previously using on the Marlin lever guns. So on that note, I think that just about covers everything about this rifle. Overall, I am extremely happy and satisfied with it, and I think I might just have to buy this rifle for myself. I really like it that much. So It's up to you guys. You can make an educated decision if this is something that you would consider adding to your collection. I do think prices are going to start coming down on these guys as Ruger pushes more and more of them out. MSRP is, after all, at $1,400. So my advice to you, if this is something you really want to add, be patient. I think Ruger will catch up with the demand eventually, and you're going to see prices come down on these guys. So on that note, I think we'll close this out. I want to thank you guys so much for watching. We really do appreciate it. If you like this video, you learned something, please let us know. Give us a thumbs up and hit the subscribe button and the bell icon alongside it so that you're notified when we post our next video. That really helps us out. It helps us spread this information with others. If you know somebody who's interested in these rifles or cartridges, please feel free to share this video with them. We will take all the support we can get at this point. And also, if you have personal experience or any questions or comments, there's a comment section below. We'd love to hear from you. Be sure to leave us a comment there and tell us all about your rifle, your experiences, or whatever it may be. So on that note, I'll leave you guys, and we'll see you in the next episode.